Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello, welcome, Kate.
Hello. We are here today to share with you some ideas to help motivate and inspire you in your mindfulness / meditation / self-compassion / really all kinds of practices that you might wish to be engaging in. You might even find it useful for all the stuff you feel like you've been trying to do but haven't gotten around to, but that feel important to you in some way. Today's conversation might give you some insights that you can use to help spring you into action. And these ideas that we'll be talking about are actually coming from a set of traditional Buddhist teachings called the Four Reminders. So as it turns out, there have been people struggling with motivation and inspiration to practice for many years, many generations, in fact. And so these traditional teachings were actually developed as a way to help inspire people to engage more fully in their practices.
Tell us what the first of these reminders is.
Yeah, actually, why don't I just quickly list all four of them, and then we can sort of circle back. So the list of four are the reminder of our precious human life, the reminder of death and impermanence, the reminder of karma or cause and effect, and the reminder of the futility of samsara. And you might initially be thinking, well, like, wait a minute, I don't know if I believe in all that stuff, karma, impermanence, death, I'm not Buddhist. Is this going to work for me? So just hang on, because we are hoping in this conversation to take some of those ideas and make them applicable kind of more broadly and expand them out from the sort of Buddhist worldview to ways that might be helpful for lots of different applications and people from different traditions. So the first one is the reminder of this precious human birth. And kind of put in context, this is sort of sits in a worldview that includes a belief about reincarnation. So in particular, Buddhist people who believe in reincarnation say, well, hey, we got born in a human life. That's pretty awesome, right? We weren't born a cockroach. We weren't born a tree. We were born a human, and that has a certain sweet spot in the sort of wheel of life. And that allows us a certain amount of self-awareness and self-reflective capability and insight, and also gives us enough comfort that we don't have to be mostly, not everyone everywhere, mostly just completely focused solely on survival and avoidance of pain or death, like many animals often live. And we also have enough suffering that the suffering inspires us to ask questions and pursue deeper understanding. And that's in contrast, again, in this sort of worldview with the sort of God realm, where people are seen as like just so peaceful and comfortable that like they never bother asking the big questions of why or, pursuing any practices or anything that might, improve their overall sort of karmic well-being in the long run, because they're just sort of living the dream. So the idea here, there's a lot to sort of unpack here. Again, even if we just sort of step back from that sort of worldview or belief system, which you may or may not share, but just sort of this idea that we're in this kind of sweet spot where we have a certain amount of privilege, and also that our suffering compels us to ask deeper questions and search for meaning. And that's something to be cherished and appreciated. They call it this precious human birth. So I think that's pretty fabulous and helpful, and a good reminder or a different way or a different perspective in thinking about our struggles.
I can see how people of any religion and no religion can relate to how precious it is to be a human being, mm-hmm. to have a human life.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very curious and precious, this idea that having difficulties, that there's great value in in facing difficulties in life, because that allows us to deepen our understanding and compassion and our skills, I suppose, in coming to grips with challenges.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, as much as we wish all of our problems would just go away, all of the pain would stop. The reality is that as long as we're living, we're likely to face some amount of obstacles in our life, some amount of challenge or struggle or problem. That's sort of just that's part of life, and it's not necessarily has to be framed as a bad part of life either. That there's something about those experiences again that sort of compel us to look for meaning, to ask deeper questions in a way that maybe in the long run we might sort of be glad we grew as a result of that hardship. I can't tell you how many people say, oh, that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But in retrospect, I wouldn't change a thing. Maybe listeners have some thoughts in mind. I've heard people say that about all kinds of experiences, health crises, that led to some personal awakening, or relationships ending that then led them to grow into better relationships. So I think there's a lot of examples where people can look back over their lives and say, oh yeah, there was something really hard there, but I grew and came out of it in a way that, like, in the end, I'm sort of glad to have grown from it.
And we tend to admire people, as a culture, we tend to admire people who have overcome great difficulty rather than people who've had very easy lives.
Right. We maybe feel jealous or or other feelings towards such people. But even them, we're comparing their outsides to our insides. So so this precious human life. Okay, so the teachings also talk about one other thing that it means to have a precious human life is that we are free and well favored, is sort of the kind of common English translation, that we have a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of favor in our lives. And traditionally, this means, that we are free in the sense of, not facing the sort of unfavorable experiences that beings in other realms do. And well favored means, again, sort of traditionally that not only are we born human, but we're born in a time where there is a Buddha, and we're born in a time where teachings flourish, in a place where they're accessible and available. We have access to the Dharma and so on. So that's the kind of traditional understanding of that. But again, I just personally feel like I often bring to this reflection thinking about my own sort of relative privilege on the planet, globally and culturally and personally, that I live in a place where at the moment there is not religious oppression and tyranny, such that I'm able to explore freely different religious and spiritual traditions and practices without being oppressed or marginalized or even persecuted for doing that, which maybe, not everybody, not all of our listeners are in those circumstances. So
True.
I'm aware that that's a privilege that I have where I am, not just in the sort of part of the world that I'm in, but also in the family that I'm in the sort of cultural context that I'm in. I live in a sort of context where sort of religious and spiritual exploration there's some acceptance to that. And many people don't have that privilege or that sort of well-favored status. They might be in a family context where it's, quite taboo to question or explore religions other than the one you were born in. So thinking of that piece of being well-favored as really a reminder to sort of check our privilege, as they say, and really, but from that sense of like sort of appreciating and then wanting to kind of make good use of the privilege that we have, that we do have these freedoms to the extent that we do. So we want to be able to use them for the benefit of all beings, right? That sort of connects to some bigger themes in Buddhism around compassion.
This is a wonderful opportunity as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not only something to be grateful for, but also a great opportunity and opening for further growth, for making the most of this opportunity.
Yeah. Another thing that gets translated as this is still connected to the first one, the precious human birth, is to think about the auspicious coincidences, which is a common translation of a sort of Buddhist idea. And I love that phrase, the auspicious coincidences that enable us to practice. And that one, I like to sort of think about what are all those auspicious coincidences, those synchronicities, those unexpected kind of coincidence-like experiences. People might call it fate or karma, or, depending on your worldview, you might have different words for it. It might just be random chance, but whatever those things are in your world that led you to have exposure to again, whatever the practice is that we're talking about. So in a general sense, meditation, mindfulness, self-compassion, there was some set of life experiences that led you to even encounter these teachings, these practices. And often when we go back and really reflect on that chain of events that led us to access these teachings or practices, they often feel like very fragile.
Yes.
Unless you really grew up surrounded by it, which I know for some people that's the case. You grew up in a Buddhist family, or you grew up in a community where people were spiritual practitioners. But for a lot of people, I think there is this experience of like, wow, that feels like a very fragile road that I walked, or a narrow path that I navigated, or, but for meeting that one person at that certain time, the direction of my life could have been very different. And so resting in that feeling of that preciousness and that sense of fragility. And again, that sort of makes you want to honor it by making good use of, these teachings or practices you've been exposed to. At least that's what it does for me. What does it bring up for you?
It's interesting to regard one's life circumstances as precious. And it does seem like it takes the big view, or the big picture, or the long view and the big picture of existence on this planet. And I guess treasuring one's life.
Yeah. And again, these reminders are set up to help stimulate some feeling and some energy and momentum to want to engage in our practice or practices, and to want to study and learn more, from these teachings. So it's good to sort of feel that preciousness. And then it's good to let that sort of propel you into I don't know how it happened, but here I am. I, started to meditate. I got access to these teachings. It's amazing. I can't believe the sort of improbability of it, given, where I was born and to whom I was born, that I've ended up where I am doing what I'm doing. But, and again, this is going to be different for different people, but wow, let me really honor that by practicing, or by living my life a certain way, doing those things that will honor this precious life that I have. And this, in a way, even in modern times, sort of rare and precious opportunity to have the privilege to have the time and energy and bandwidth to study and practice at all, even just for a few minutes.
So when we say reminders, are we talking about texts that enumerate all the different ways in which we are favored? Look what can happen, actually.
Yes, right. There are, in fact, when we talk about being free and well-favored, there are, in fact, 8 unfavorable states and 10 auspicious coincidences, and so on. So you can, go to the root texts to access the sort of deeper unpacking of this that different teachers have done. So I had sort of summarized briefly that the unfavorable states include not being born in a hell realm, and, not being born a hungry ghost, and, some of the things that maybe don't resonate as much with people who aren't sure they share that cosmology, or the auspicious coincidences, that we're born in a time where there is a Buddha, that the teachings have proliferated in the realm in which we live, and so on. So let's move ahead to the next one, which is the reality of death and impermanence, which is heavy. And the two of death is sort of the ultimate reminder of impermanence. So you might say impermanence is sort of the bigger umbrella, and death is sort of one of the many impermanences and that we have to sort of contend with in life. So one thing that's talked about in this aspect, this reminder, is that life is fragile. And again, there's whole texts that go into all the different ways in which life is fragile, and, all the many ways where we could perish and we're unlikely to make it another day or hour, So again, those traditional texts enumerate these things, but we can just think of our own lives, and not to freak anyone out, but just to sort of have a reality that we don't know what the day holds. We do engage in, risky behaviors on a given day. If you drive, if you're a pedestrian, there are certain things that we do just day to day that are fairly risky. I mean, the risk is low, but, as anyone who's, made much of a study of it knows, driving is more risky than getting in an airplane, even though many of us are more scared of flying than driving and so on. And that we just don't know, right? We can't predict the future. We're not guaranteed a lifespan of a given length. So again, as a reminder to encourage practice and study, right? It's not just to bring you down or make you feel scared to leave your house. It's designed to make you go like, oh man, the clock's ticking, right? The clock's ticking down, and I don't know. This is a clock that I don't know where it ends. Like you might think the clock is running until you're 100, but it might actually only be running till you're 70 or 50. I mean, who knows? We just don't know. It's a clock that is running down and has an unknown sort of moment of stoppage as an inspiration, as a reminder of like making the best use of your time. Keeping that perspective is extremely useful. And there are many people, many secular people who talk about the importance of keeping this awareness in their mind. In fact, I think it was Steve Jobs who used to have some practice he did in the morning where it was like, if I look at myself and ask myself, do I want to be doing this on the last day of my life? Or I forget what it was, but he has some question that he would ask himself to help chart his course and make sure he was on the right path by continuously reminding himself of, is this how I want to be spending my time if this were the final hours or days?
So is creating urgency and enhancing an awareness and gratitude part of it? Perhaps not expressly.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's a natural tendency to move towards feeling more grateful or appreciative for the life you have, especially on the heels of the precious human birth contemplation. That then starting to contemplate the fragility and uncertainty of the length of life and the certainty of death, that might well stimulate a lot of gratitude and appreciation.
Calling it a contemplation, is it sort of you have 30 minutes to riff on this topic?
Yeah, there are different ways in which this contemplation is done. There are some guided practices that you can access that will give you 5 or 10 minutes with each one. You could do a retreat where you spend a whole day on each of the 4, one whole day on the precious human birth, one whole day on death and impermanence and so on. Or you could spend 1 minute, you might just read a sentence or two of a text that this comes out of and just contemplate that sentence for a minute or two and just, 4 reminders, 4 minutes. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very flexible in that way. It can be shrunk and expanded. And there are some guided practices available and some traditional texts, as well as some kind of modern translations that you can work with.
So I can also imagine a very compelling text or documentary that can really sort of grab people and make them aware of the parameters.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another part of the death and impermanence is that it's a reminder that practicing actually helps us prepare spiritually / mentally / emotionally, what have you, for the time of death. So the idea being that stabilizing our minds in good times and bad every day on the cushion or in your practice, that actually can serve us during the time of great uncertainty as we're perhaps facing the end of our life, whatever that might look like, whether it comes on suddenly or at the end of a long illness. There's quite a lot of uncertainty and emotionality and of that, right? So to be able to kind of ride the ultimate wave the best we can, learning to stabilize our mind and practice with the day-to-day life is extremely beneficial. And again, if you share the cosmology and worldview of many Buddhists, then you also believe your consciousness goes on after you die and that you can continue to remain mindfulness even after your body passes away, and it can help you find your next rebirth and so on. Again, I'm kind of not emphasizing that part as much in this conversation, knowing that not all of our listeners share that worldview, but that's another piece of it as well.
So putting one's affairs in order with full awareness of what is to come rather than thinking we're on a vacation.
Right. Yeah. And then also just being able to be mindful, to mindfully experience your final days, your final breaths, your final moments, to be able to not be like completely freaked out, but what's happening? Myself is dissolving or whatever, to sort of have some stability that you can be more present in that moment. Many people, maybe many listeners, I know myself from some of my work with people in hospice and palliative care, some people have very peaceful deaths, and some people seem very, very troubled and agitated because, sometimes it's physical pain, sometimes it's emotional pain, who knows, it's hard to even understand sometimes what's going on inside people's lived experience in those moments. But again, the idea is that being able to practice mindfulness and meditation may help us navigate that transition with more stability and ease and equanimity.
Sounds very precious.
And then the impermanence part, just much bigger, like just not like we can tuck death aside for a moment now. Everyone can take a deep breath, but just thinking about the impermanence, the ups and downs of life, right? So when you have a time in your life where you feel like there's some stability enough to engage in some practice and some study, that is a precious opportunity to make use of that time, because we don't know how long it will last. We don't know how long we'll have the health to be able to sit in a meditation posture all day. And while, of course, we can adapt our posture, it will be different if we need to do it laying in a hospital bed. The experience might be different if we want to try to do a whole day of practice and go on a retreat. It's going to be much harder if we are dependent on other people to help us with our healthcare, or our activities of daily living. Or even just like if you have transitions in life, right, where you don't have a child now, but you're planning to have a child. And that, after you have that baby, you're going to be super busy for a while, and it's going to be hard to fit in the time you want for meditation and mindfulness initially. You might be exhausted for a long time. So making use of this little bit of space you have now, knowing that that's coming down the pipeline. Or on the other side, when you've been very busy raising your kids for a long time, and then those kids go away on summer vacation or they go off to college or whatever, something that gives you a little more space in your schedule and your calendar, that those moments are very precious because they're not lasting. You may only have a few weeks before they come back from visiting their grandparents or, what have you. Maybe the kids move back home after college and, it's a little bit harder to get that space and that silence to engage in the deep practice you want to. So just thinking about the vicissitudes of life, the ups and downs of family life, the ups and downs of availability of free time, sort of looking at all the ways that our life circumstances are impermanent. And if we have a very stable and peaceful situation now, and we have ample time to practice, to really cherish that and to know that that's not going to last forever necessarily. I'm thinking even of my own schedule, that I have a fairly flexible schedule, and I'm able to start my day a little bit later than a lot of people. And so I'm able to get up and have time to meditate in the morning without having to rush off and punch the clock at 8 a.m. or something. So that facilitates my practice, but that doesn't mean that that's forever, right? Especially with the pandemic, there's been a lot of uncertainty in the work world, and who knows what might happen, that
economic
sort of work life. Yeah, the economic conditions that could change on a dime. And suddenly I need to get a job that has me punching the clock at 8 a.m. to make ends meet. So again, just thinking about these reminders, this sort of sense of impermanence. I like that word you use, urgency, right? This idea that it creates a sense of urgency for us to practice when the time does permit, when the circumstances do permit, because we aren't guaranteed that they'll last that way forever.
I mean, I love that sense of urgency. I feel like when I'm on vacation and I want to fill every day with precious experiences, as opposed to like, I could always do it tomorrow or next month.
Right. Exactly. That's a good analogy.
And it would be wonderful to have that in relation to one's daily life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So this reminder is meant to help do just that. And moving along here to the third reminder, which is the reminder of karma or cause and effect And again, you can sort of flex this according to your own sort of belief system. The traditional view is that what we do in our life generates karma, and that karma may ripen during this lifespan or during a future lifetime, and that the long-term ongoing consequences of our actions direct our current life and our experiences as well as our future rebirths. And so there's a lot of consideration about how we spend our life now will impact us in lifetimes to come. So that, again, if you share that worldview, you might think of it that way. If you don't share that worldview, you could just stay within this lifespan. I think that's still a pretty solid, useful message that there are effects to our actions, that the things that we do tend to bear fruit, will ripen eventually. It brings up for me this sort of, some of the things that have been coming out in the news about people's past misdeeds and bad behavior and, things like the Me Too movement and, actions that people have engaged in decades ago being outed, now. And yeah, right. That it's a good example of this idea that it takes time sometimes for things to ripen. But then when the circumstances permit, the consequences do, and of course, we can have another conversation in another episode, maybe about, does that happen to everybody at all times? Does everyone have a consequence for their actions and so on? Because it does seem sometimes that there are people who engage in terrible misdeeds that don't experience consequences for it. But I do know from my own life that there is a very simple, pragmatic degree of cause and effect, right? If I don't eat well for a few days, I feel sluggish. If I overwork, I exhaust myself, right? If I'm not taking care of my stress, I get a stress-related illness. That there are ways in which the way we treat ourselves and our bodies impact our health, impact our relationships with our loved ones, impact our functional capacities, our functioning at work. So if it's easy, I think, to get like really big and sort of overwrought sometimes with these ideas, it turns into like philosophy class. And that can be useful at times to do, but I think sometimes we can get further away from the sort of, at least in this practice, that sort of basic message of like, hey, if you meditate today, it's going to help you down the line. Like, hey, if you practice or study now, like that's going to bear fruit for you in a useful way somewhere in the future. Stick with it.
In moments we may fritter away or throw away actions, they add up, or absence of more substantial actions, we pay for it in some way.
Yes,
that's the idea.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And this isn't to sort of berate ourselves and sort of chastise ourselves for, maybe past things that we have regret for or something like that. It's really, again, designed to enhance our motivation and inspiration to engage in practice and study now. And it also, even off the cushion, it's a useful reminder here about how we want to live our lives, in terms of what kind of impact do we want our lives to have in the long term? What do we want to orient our lives around that really matters to us?
I mean, that's interesting. In our conversation so far, I'm starting to feel a degree of anxiety and suffering.
Oh, no. Or maybe, oh, yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Our conversation may well be basically a contemplation practice, right? We're sort of asking you and our listeners to go on this ride with us and think these things through. So if it does create a sense of unease, that as you're saying, maybe that unease is something that could compel you to kind of jiggle the the focus, of your life so that it's more oriented towards the things that matter most to you.
Is a certain amount of unease expected or encouraged, like sort of by the teachers, that when you first start to contemplate this, like you have that, oh my gosh, moment?
I have not experienced encouragement to feel uneasy, but I have rarely experienced a person who does this who doesn't feel some amount of unease.
And I imagine getting people out of their complacency must be part of the larger idea.
Right. Yeah. And this one also around the sort of cause and effect also encourages us to sort of, again, what are we orienting our life around? What are the values that are guiding our life? So there's this list and so they like these lists, right? So this section often gets sort of connected to not engaging in, quote, sometimes translated as evil actions, which sounds like, well, I'm not murdering anyone, so a check, you think like that sounds really scary and I'm probably not doing that. But then if you actually sort of circle through what's meant by that, it's more like, it's not just evil in the sense that many of us might hear that word as like really gross negligence or malice. It's also just like those actions that are kind of self-absorbed, or the preoccupations with maintaining our own personal comfort, for example. There's a list of worldly concerns that are sort of encouraged to move away from. So the worldly concerns, which again, we can put the whole list in the show notes, but the worldly concerns include things like being preoccupied with finding experiences of pleasure and avoiding pain, to seek personal gain and avoid loss of any kind, to seek praise from others and avoid sort of blame or disgrace in any way, to seek fame, to maintain a good reputation and to not be disgraced, or to not even, sometimes people are just very scared of not mattering at all, or that fear of insignificance. But the way in which those things all kind of shape and drive our life towards focusing on our own personal, what's best for me, not what's best for the planet, what's best for the world, what's best for my community, a view that might be more kind of a bodhisattva view, or more of a view of sort of open compassion. And so when we're thinking about cause and effect, the more sort of self-absorbed we are and concerned only for our own personal comfort, the more down the line, we're probably going to end up suffering.
So a nuanced, detailed understanding of evil, rather than if you're not a mafia boss or
right.
an arms merchant, you're okay.
Right. Right.
And living one's life in a very intentional way and being aware of all the consequences and implications. I see.
Right. Like, what if I weren't so preoccupied with just achieving my own personal comfort? Maybe I'd be willing to be uncomfortable for a cause that mattered to me. Hey, maybe that, might cause me to engage in a different set of actions than I do on my weekends or in my free time. So again, these reminders are designed to help us engage in more practice and more study, and but also to sort of move our lives more towards, a more kind of compassionate, existence, and again, sort of in line with Buddhist teachings generally, since this is the tradition in which it comes out of, but you can apply it very generally as well. And then our last one is called the futility of samsara. So this is the fourth and the final reminder. And this is a reminder to use the kind of first noble truth idea that to be born means to suffer in some way, that life is characterized by struggle, suffering. Insert your favorite translation of the first noble truth here. I think discomfort, you have a couple, Alex, right? Discomfort.
Unease.
Right. Yeah. That as long as dukkha, right? As long as we are alive and we have this precious human birth, we are also bound to have difficulties and struggle and suffer. And we tend to keep trying to make life fit our plan to make us happy and comfortable. Like I was saying before, along those sort of worldly concerns, right? To seek personal comfort at all cost and that sort of thing. And this one here, this reminder of the sort of futility of samsara is like, that's never going to work. Because it is the nature of life that we will have problems and that we will suffer and struggle and experience unease. We cannot escape that. It is futile to try.
A certain amount of suffering.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I don't mean to say like it's you're bound to be overwhelmed by suffering at all in every moment. Yeah.
At the same time, I suppose there are levels of suffering.
Yes.
That one could rise out of to get to an ordinary amount of suffering, I suppose.
Well, so it sort of challenges the personal development mindset a little bit here, right? That there's no that it's futile that it's futile to try to fix or improve samsara, right? Fix or improve the suffering of life. And in fact, suffering comes from the things that we think relieve us from suffering. So how much struggle do you experience in your personal development goal to try to achieve perfect mental health, for instance? Do we experience a lot of pain and struggle on the way of trying to make ourselves a better person or trying to heal our anxiety or whatever, right? I'm not healing fast enough. Something's going wrong with my treatment. All of these things actually, even though it's in the service of trying to improve ourselves, and I'm not saying personal improvement's always a terrible thing, but it does bring with it a lot of suffering. So some of the traditional teachings talk about for this reminder that what we think is a source of comfort actually brings us pain. We think of our home as a place of comfort, perhaps, but it causes us the struggle of how am I going to make ends meet? It's a major financial burden, maybe. We're not always sure where the mortgage is coming from. Or when there's a storm, our basement floods or whatever. Or our relationships, that maybe give us great pleasure and offer great comfort and support to us, also bring with it certain battles, certain struggles, right? You argue with the people you love. You have disagreements, so, even wealth, right? When we have a lot of money, it may solve some problems, but it creates new problems. So it's just saying that we can't escape this, right? That there is something inherent. Sometimes people talk about the kind of fundamental unease or inherent discomfort of life, right? Like I think it was Trungpa Rinpoche who called it like a basic anxiety that we all sort of carry, a fundamental discomfort just in our sort of day-to-day existence. That is samsara, right? That is life.
And I think Buddhism goes into some detail about different varieties of dukkha. So you're pointing out here, one is sort of like a background, sort of like a static level of anxiety, but also you're saying almost like a yin-yang graphic, like even things that are causes of great happiness contain within them aspects of suffering.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Nothing else.
Yeah. So one of the lists is 3 different kinds of suffering. The suffering that I was just describing of just sort of fundamental discomfort. And then the suffering of change, which means like the things we like will also end. Right. So that means that when we're comfortable, that's going to end. So we don't like change when it means the good stuff goes away. So there's going to be the pain and the suffering that comes with when your good circumstances end. And then there's also the suffering of suffering itself, which is actually the suffering of when you experience pain or displeasure or discomfort. So when you're actually like actively unhappy or in pain in some way, that's a kind of suffering. And then another kind of suffering is when you lose that which was comfortable or desirable in some way. And then there's just the sort of ongoing fundamental, just life is suffering kind of suffering. And so what's the point of this one in terms of inspiring us to practice? The point of this one is to help us remember that as long as we look to the outer world and the circumstances of our life and that we're able to create and or not, or struggle to achieve, then we're bound to have difficulty and pain. But the more we stop trying to fix samsara and make it all cozy for us, and the more instead we bring our awareness to practice, just being with whatever is arising in our life, then we may start to actually find ourselves better off in the long run.
So for instance, living in a healthy way and exercising, is that futile?
I think there's a double answer there. I think on the relative plane of ordinary life, right, in sort of day-to-day experiencing, you're likely to reduce your overall net load of suffering, right? If your body is healthier, you're less likely to experience even more pain than you already experienced just by virtue of being alive. So taking care of your body may well reduce your sort of overall load of suffering. So sure, do it. That's great. That's one answer in a sort of ordinary reality. The other answer is kind of more existential, which is like, well, healthy bodies also die. Healthy bodies don't guarantee a longer lifespan, even if they make them more probable. Healthy bodies can become a source of suffering in the sense that we, then have to sustain them and sort of build our ego around, look at how healthy I am and I'm so well taken care of. And, whatever you might get, it may become a source of ego or pride, which then causes other problems for you in your life. You kind of have to think on multiple levels, sort of put up one lens and you see it one way, put up another lens and you see it another way.
No, yeah, I like that. It's a deeper questioning.
So I hope that this conversation was fruitful, and that if you're experiencing any unease as a result of reflecting on these with us today, that you will take that unease and let it compel you to reorient your life in some small way, maybe today or this week, towards what is most important to you, towards what you really value, towards what would make an actually fulfilling, meaningful life in the long run. And that perhaps that unease or just sense of inspiration that can come as we focus on these can help inspire us to engage in, whether it's meditation, prayer, study, mindfulness practice, whatever those things are. So I said, some of these have more applications when you frame them in the sort of Buddhist worldview. Others are quite rich, even just from a very secular perspective. So thanks for listening. Thanks for engaging in the conversation, Alex.
Thank you for sharing these. I'm intrigued.
We will put some more resources in the show notes. You can join our email list and hear more about the 4 reminders and more from us in the future. But bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.